This is sequence space. We also just went off a little bit into information theory. Now here's Dr. Pittman describing the sequence space and what's happening there. This exponentially declining ratio that we talked about just a moment ago is literally lethal to mainstream evolutionary views of origins when it comes to any sort of useful scientific understanding of the mechanism involved with supposed evolutionary progress over vast periods of time. The mechanism of random mutation and natural selection is simply assumed to be valid in literature, not because of scientific demonstration or relevant statistical analysis beyond very low levels of functional complexity, but because there simply are no other options outside of an appeal to pre-existing higher level informational systems. In other words, to put it very simply, it has to work. Because if we've already decided at the outset that God didn't do it and there was an intelligent input, well, then we have to have some non-supervised, non-intelligent process that will get us this outcome. Okay? It has to work. In fact, look at this fascinating quotation here from Alvin Plantinga, where the conflict really lies. This is great. Watch this. For the non-theist or the atheist, undirected evolution is the only game in town. It's the only option available. And natural selection seems to be the most plausible mechanism to drive that process. Here is this stunningly intricate world. You know, you go outside, you look at it, and you're like, man, look at the birds, and look at the trout that fill our rivers, and the salmon that come up. The world is awesome. Can you say amen to that? Amen. The world is awesome. He says, hey, here is this stunningly intricate world with its enormous diversity and apparent design. Nobody denies that there is the appearance of design. Nobody. Right? From the perspective of naturalism or non-theism or materialism, the only way it could have happened was by way of unguided Darwinian evolution. Hence, it must have happened that way. Hence, there must be such a Darwinian series for each current life form. The theist, that is you and I, the believer in God, on the other hand, has a little more freedom here. Oh, that's an interesting idea. We have more freedom. Why? Maybe there is such a series and maybe there isn't. Maybe God has created the living world and could have done it in any number of different ways. There doesn't have to be any such series. In this way, the theist is freer to follow the evidence where it leads. Right? Because for the Darwinian evolutionist, the committed naturalist, this is the way it must have happened. It's the only show in town. Right? It's like saying, hey, where do you want to go out to eat? There's only one restaurant in town. We're going to eat there. You know, at Big Dave's Diner or whatever. That's the only gig in town. If there is no God and there was no intelligent source or input, well, then we have to somehow come up with a process or a mechanism that can give us this level of complexity, and the best available candidate over the last 150 years is random mutation coupled with natural selection. So you can see now why it's absolutely essential to believe in the efficiency of random mutation, natural selection to give us the diversity of life that we see in the world. Because if that's not it, then what is it? And this is often, the debate is often sort of cast as though it's the theist or the Bible believer or the Christian that's sort of narrow-minded and shallow and can't follow the evidence where it leads. But Plantinga says actually the opposite. The theist is a little freer because maybe there is something that looks like a Darwinian sequence, or maybe there's not. But for the Darwinian, there has to be. For us, well, we can leave it or take it. Take it or leave it. Okay, this is a great quotation here. Also from Plantinga's book, the Duke of Argyll recounts a conversation he had with Darwin the year before Darwin died in, I think, 1882. So this would have been 1881. I said to Mr. Darwin, with reference to some of his own remarkable works on the fertilization of orchids and various other observations he made, of the wonderful contrivances for certain purposes in nature, I said it was impossible to look at these without seeing they were the effect and expression of mind. Now remember, that's coming up again and again. Mind. So this is the Duke of Argyll saying, man, specifically apparently with regards to the something that he had written on the fertilization of orchids. And he's like, man, this particular mechanism, doesn't that just seem, it just seems, he says, that these are the effect and expression of mind. He says, I shall never forget Mr. Darwin's answer. He looked at me very hard and said, well, that often comes over me with overwhelming force. The idea that this is an expression of mind, that all of these little intricacies of the details, for example, of the fertilization of orchids or anything Man, this looks designed. Looks like it's the product of intelligence. Looks like it's the product of mind. Darwin said the year before he died, well, that often comes over me with an overwhelming force, but at other times, and he shook his head vaguely and said, it seems to go away. Now, this is very important because it gives us an insight into the reality that evolutionists like Darwin and Dawkins and others, there are thousands and tens of thousands of them now, they're in a constant state of tension between the appearance of design, but they don't believe in actual design. So it looks like it's been designed, and of course they have a designer that's not really a designer, and the designer is the process of random mutation and natural selection that creates what they believe is the appearance of design. What we believe is that it's not just the appearance of design, but it's actual design. The reason that things look like they were designed for specific purposes and to fulfill specific biological niches and to work and to fit together so nicely as they do is because they were designed that way by an intelligence that created them. So both the evolutionist, the naturalistic evolutionist, and the Bible believer, we agree that that things look designed. We just disagree about what's the best explanation. We believe the best explanation is mind or intelligence, and they believe that it's non-mental processes, natural processes, okay? You sort of seeing the points of commonality and the points of conflict there? Okay. I want to talk to you now about something that I find hugely persuasive, and it's the next one, top of the page. Next one down says, it cannot account for the origin of life, and below that, it cannot explain the human brain, the mind, and the origin and nature of human consciousness. Just briefly on the origin of life. I've already spent a little bit of time on this, but the problem arises in believing that a biological reality came from an abiological reality. That is to say that matter gave rise to life. This has never been observed in any laboratory. Every biological experiment that's ever been conducted in the history of the scientific enterprise has shown that life comes from life. Children come from their parents, and foals come from stallions and mares, and fish come from fish. Life comes from life, right? We know this. It's just intuitive. But if you rewind the evolutionary tape backward, at some point, there had to be a non-living universe, right? Carbon, nitrogen, helium, all of these elements, and then you transition through the collection of amino acids that became proteins that somehow assembled, and there is no known mechanism for this, okay? So in that sense, and I wouldn't want to come off as condescending, that is belief in what amounts to a miracle, right? It requires faith to believe that that happened because we have no scientific evidence as such that it could happen. Now, there are well-meaning men and women who have assembled various compounds and molecular configurations and chemicals into beakers and heated chambers, and they've heated it up and they've electrocuted it, and they've done a lot of things. They've produced some amino acids and I think even some proteins. Most classically is the Miller-Urey experiment from the 1950s. But even here, all this would show, if it could be done to produce life, was that it took intelligence to do it. Right? That would actually, in a subtle way, buttress the basic point that yes, it can be done. It hasn't yet been done, but it could be done, but it required intelligence. The idea is that this happened without a superintending force, without an intelligent cause, and people are welcome to believe that, but the point is there's no known mechanism for it. It's a matter of faith to believe that it happened. And if you say, well, if you say to a naturalistic evolutionist, where's the evidence that it happened? Well, they would say, you're looking at it. Because here we are, we're alive, and it must have happened. Again, that goes back to the fact that if naturalistic evolution is the only show in town, it had to have happened. Do you understand that point? We don't have any scientific explanation. We don't have any known mechanism, and just a word on that. You can't say that random mutation and natural selection did it, because random mutation and natural selection requires living things in order to work. This is how did you get the first living thing, and evolution can't be used to describe how we got the first living thing. Evolution can only talk about perhaps the modification and adaptation of living things, but that's not the question we're asking. We're asking, how did we get the first living thing? And you can't, it's like trying to talk about the rules of grammar before we have letters and before we have letters. We can't talk about the rules of grammar until we have letters. You can't talk about the evolution and adaptation of life until we have what?
Life.
So you have life. Okay, so that's the